You've probably had a moment in your life where you went too far. A decision you justified in the moment, defended afterward, but replayed at night when no one was watching. You tell yourself it was necessary. You tell yourself anyone else would have done the same, but deep down, something feels off. I know that feeling intimately because there is one thing I did as a Navy SEAL that still follows me, and it's not the firefights or the bullets. It's the moment I crossed a line I didn't even know existed until it was already behind me. I want to be very clear right from the start. This isn't a war story meant to impress you. This isn't about heroics. This is about the most horrific thing I've done and how easily it happened once pressure took over. Because when people hear SEAL, they imagine discipline, control, restraint. What they don't understand is how close that control sits to something far more dangerous. The night it happened, everything felt routine, too routine. That's often how it starts. No dramatic music, no warning signs, just muscle memory and confidence built from years of training. We were operating in an environment where hesitation could get you killed. According to military psychology research, once adrenaline and cortisol spike past a certain threshold, the brain stops weighing morality and starts prioritizing efficiency. I didn't know that study back then. I just knew the mission mattered more than feelings. Here's the dangerous part. Training works. It works so well that it can silence the part of you that asks, should I be doing this? SEAL training drills this into you early. Control emotion, execute the plan, finish the mission. And most of the time, that mindset saves lives. It saved mine more than once. That's the hopeful part. Structure, discipline, and clarity under pressure are powerful tools, but that same mindset has a shadow. That night, a situation escalated faster than it should have. Every step made sense in isolation. Each decision felt justified by the one before it. This is how lines disappear. You don't leap over them, you inch past them. Researchers who study moral drift call this incremental escalation, where small compromises stack until the final outcome looks unrecognizable in hindsight. In the moment, though, it feels normal, necessary, even correct. I remember the exact second my stomach tightened. Not fear, not doubt, something colder. A realization that if I were watching this from the outside, I'd be disturbed. But instead of stopping, I pushed forward. That's the mistake people don't like to admit. We believe clarity will stop us when we're about to go too far. It doesn't. Momentum does the opposite. It carries you forward. SEALs are taught a simple internal check to regain control under stress, slow the breath, widen awareness, re-anchor to intent, not impulse. It's a small thing, almost stupidly simple, but it works when you use it. The problem is, when pressure peaks, most people skip it. I skipped it. I told myself there wasn't time. And that's the lie pressure always tells you, that stopping for 1 second will cost you everything. The mission succeeded. On paper, it was a win. That's what made it worse. Because later, when everything went quiet, the question hit me hard. If this worked, why does it feel like something went very wrong? That was the moment I realized something they don't teach you in training. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And once you cross certain lines, you don't just walk back over them, you carry them. If you're watching this because you feel like your own life is pushing you toward a place you don't recognize, understand this. The danger isn't weakness. The danger is unchecked momentum. And if you don't learn to interrupt it early, it will take you further than you ever planned to go. What most people don't realize is that elite training doesn't just make you capable, it makes you efficient. And efficiency, under the wrong conditions, is dangerous. When you're trained to move fast, decide fast, and act without hesitation, the margin for reflection gets razor thin. That's not a flaw in the system. It's the system working exactly as designed. The problem is that the human mind isn't a machine, no matter how much we try to treat it like one. In the teams, we were taught that hesitation kills, and that's true. In a hostile environment, a half second of doubt can cost lives. So from day one, training is designed to burn out hesitation. Repetition replaces deliberation. Muscle memory replaces conscious thought. According to researchers who study high-performance soldiers, this kind of conditioning shifts decision-making from the prefrontal cortex, where reasoning happens, to deeper survival centers of the brain. You don't think, you execute. That's why elite units are elite. Here's the dangerous part. That same mechanism doesn't know the difference between a tactical threat and a moral one. When pressure hits, your brain doesn't ask if something aligns with your values. It asks if it solves the problem in front of you. That's why highly trained people can do things they would never do in normal life and genuinely believe they were right in the moment. I wasn't angry. I wasn't out of control. That's what scares people when they hear this. I was calm, focused, locked in, and that made everything that followed easier. The military knows this risk. That's why rules of engagement exist. That's why we drilled scenarios where restraint mattered more than aggression. In theory, those rules are the solution. They're designed to be guardrails, especially when emotions are running hot. Psychologists embedded with special operations units have written about this exact issue. Training gives you power, and power without restraint always looks for justification. But here's the mistake almost everyone makes, both in combat and in civilian life. They assume rules will automatically activate when needed. They won't. Rules don't stop momentum, people do. And under stress, people default to what feels fastest, not what's wisest. I've seen this play out far beyond the battlefield. In business leaders who push teams past ethical limits because results matter. In parents who justify harsh decisions because they're for your own good. In relationships where someone crosses a line and says, I didn't mean to, pressure compresses time. And when time feels compressed, values feel optional. There is, however, a solution that actually works, and it's almost embarrassingly simple. It's not willpower. It's not morality speeches. It's a deliberate interruption. SEAL psychologists teach something called a pattern break, a physical, measurable pause that forces the nervous system to downshift. One controlled breath longer than the inhale, a widening of visual focus, a silent question. What is the intent right now? That tiny interruption creates just enough space for choice to return. Studies on stress performance show that even a 3-second pause can restore cognitive control under extreme pressure. 3 seconds. That's it. Not a meditation session, not deep reflection, just enough to stop the slide. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost no one uses it when they need it most because the ego steps in. You tell yourself you're beyond that you don't have time, that stopping is weakness. I believe that too. I thought discipline meant pushing through everything. What I didn't understand was that discipline without restraint turns into force. That night, I let training run unchecked. I trusted efficiency over awareness. And once that switch flipped, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt justified. That's how far elite conditioning can take you if you're not careful. The real lesson isn't that training is bad. It's that training amplifies whatever you bring into the moment. If you bring clarity, it multiplies clarity. If you bring unchecked urgency, it multiplies damage. And if you don't consciously reinsert humanity into high-pressure moments, training will quietly remove it for you. That's the part nobody warns you about. And by the time you notice, you're already moving too fast to stop. There's a moment in every high-pressure situation where things stop being loud on the outside and get very quiet inside. That's the moment people think clarity has arrived. They think, this is it. I know exactly what to do. What they don't realize is that this silence can be the most dangerous point of all. That's where I was when it happened. Not confused, not overwhelmed, focused to a fault. Up to that point, everything had followed the logic of training. Threat identified, variables reduced, control established. Each step flowed into the next so cleanly that there was no friction, no resistance from my own mind. That's what elite conditioning does. According to after-action analyses used by special operations units, the highest risk decisions are often made not during chaos, but during moments of perceived control. When you feel ahead of the situation, you stop questioning the direction you're moving in. I remember thinking, if we stop now, we lose the advantage. That thought alone was enough to push me forward. It didn't feel like aggression. It felt like responsibility. That's how pressure disguises itself. It wears the mask of duty, and once you accept that mask, anything can be justified underneath it. The exact moment it went too far wasn't dramatic. There was no single action that screamed, this is wrong. Instead, there was a subtle internal shift, a tightening in my chest, a brief awareness that we were no longer reacting to a threat but enforcing an outcome. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Reacting is about safety. Enforcing is about control. And control, once it becomes the goal, rarely stops on its own. Researchers who study moral injury describe this as the point where identity fractures. Your actions still align with your role, but no longer with your self-image. I didn't have language for that at the time. I just knew something had detached inside me. And instead of slowing down, I doubled down. Because when you've invested that much momentum, stopping feels like admitting failure. Here's the part that still unsettles me. I was calm, my voice was steady, my decisions were precise. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen a professional executing under pressure. That's why this matters. People assume losing control looks like rage or panic. It doesn't. Sometimes it looks like competence. I told myself this was the fastest way to end the situation, that once it was over, everything would reset. That's a common cognitive shortcut under stress. Studies on crisis decision-making show that the brain seeks closure more than correctness when under sustained pressure. End the problem, and the discomfort will go away. That belief is powerful, and it's often wrong. When it was finally done, there was no rush of relief, no sense of victory, just silence. And in that silence, the thought surfaced clearly for the first time. If I had paused, even briefly, this would have gone differently. That realization didn't feel like guilt yet, it felt like shock, the kind that settles in slowly, layer by layer. After action reports later labeled the mission a success. Objectives met, risks mitigated, on paper it was clean. That's the part that makes these moments so difficult to talk about. There's no external consequence to point to, no obvious mistake. The cost was internal, and those don't show up in debriefs. Military psychologists now recognize this pattern well. They note that moral injury often stems not from doing something illegal, but from doing something that violates your personal code while fulfilling your professional one. That night, my role won, my values lost. And once that balance tips, it leaves a mark. What haunted me wasn't what we did, it was how easy it was to do it, how seamlessly training, pressure, and justification aligned. That's when I understood that the most dangerous moments aren't when you feel out of control, they're when you feel completely justified. That was the point of no return, not because the action couldn't be undone, but because I knew I had crossed a line I could no longer pretend didn't exist. What nobody prepares you for is what happens after everything goes quiet. There's this assumption that once the mission ends, once you're out of the environment, your nervous system will reset and you'll go back to normal. That's the fantasy. The reality is that the body may leave the battlefield, but the mind doesn't follow on command. At first, I didn't feel anything. That worried me more than panic would have. According to military mental health research, emotional numbness is often the first sign that the brain is still operating in survival mode. It's a protective mechanism. You tell yourself you're fine because you're functional, you're sleeping, you're training, you're doing your job. On the surface, nothing is wrong, but something had shifted. I started replaying moments I'd never questioned before, not obsessively at first, just flashes, a look, a tone in my own voice, a decision point I barely noticed in real time. Psychologists call this delayed moral processing. When the brain finally has enough safety to evaluate what happened, it starts filling in the emotional gaps it suppressed earlier, and it doesn't ask politely. The military teaches decompression for a reason, slow reintegration, structured downtime, reconnection with normal routines. Those systems exist because researchers discovered that elite operators who skip this phase are far more likely to experience long-term psychological strain. The solution is known, it's built into the system. But here's the mistake almost every high performer makes. They think decompression is for people who are broken. They think strength means pushing forward without looking back. That was my mindset. I told myself I'd earned the right not to think about it, that it was over, that revisiting it would only weaken me. Silence became my strategy, and silence works for a while until it doesn't. What nobody tells you is that guilt doesn't show up screaming. It shows up whispering, in impatience, in detachment, in the way you snap at people who don't deserve it, in the way you feel disconnected from moments that should matter. Veteran therapists often describe moral injury as a loss of meaning rather than a surge of fear. That description hit me hard when I finally heard it because fear wasn't the problem, emptiness was. There is a method military psychologists recommend for this phase, and it surprised me when I learned about it. It's not reliving the event, it's not confession, it's structured acknowledgement, naming the moment without dramatizing it, accepting responsibility without self destruction. Studies show that veterans who engage in this process early are significantly more resilient long term. The key is controlled exposure, not avoidance. But again, here's the trap. Most operators wait too long. They wait until relationships suffer, until sleep becomes fragmented, until anger replaces clarity. I waited. I told myself I could out-discipline the problem. That's a lie. Discipline tells you when it's missing humility. The turning point for me wasn't a breakdown. It was a conversation with someone who understood the system from the inside. They said something simple that cut through everything. You're carrying this because you never gave yourself permission to process it. That's when it clicked. Strength had kept me alive. But strength alone wasn't going to make me whole. Researchers who work with special operations units emphasize one principle over and over. Moral injury heals through integration, not erasure. You don't delete the experience, you contextualize it. You place it inside a broader identity that isn't defined by a single moment. That requires honesty, and honesty is uncomfortable. The hopeful part is this. Once I stopped pretending nothing happened, the weight began to shift, not disappear, shift. The lesson emerged slowly. Control isn't just about dominating external chaos. It's about taking responsibility for internal consequences, and ignoring those consequences doesn't make you strong. It makes you brittle. What I learned in the aftermath changed how I lead, how I decide, and how I define success. because the real damage wasn't the moment itself. It was what would have happened if I kept refusing to face it. That's the part nobody trains you for, and it's the part that matters most once the mission is over. For a long time, I told myself this was a military problem, a product of war, pressure, and circumstances most people would never face. That belief made it easier to compartmentalize. If this only happens in extreme environments, then it doesn't apply anywhere else. But the more distance I got from that chapter of my life, the more I realized how wrong that assumption was. What happened to me wasn't unique to combat. Combat just compresses consequences. It strips situations down to their rawest form. But the same pattern shows up everywhere pressure exists. Boardrooms, hospitals, homes, anywhere expectations are high and time feels scarce. People start making the same kinds of decisions for the same reasons. I've watched business leaders cross ethical lines not because they were bad people, but because they were under relentless performance pressure. They told themselves just this once, or we'll fix it later. Psychologists who study leadership under stress call this moral licensing. When people believe their past discipline or success gives them permission to bend rules in the present, the logic is identical to what I experienced in uniform. Different setting, same mechanism. Parents do it too. They justify control as protection. They override empathy in the name of authority. I know what's best becomes a shield against reflection. According to family systems researchers, high-stress households often drift into rigid control not because of cruelty, but because fear is misidentified as responsibility. Again, pressure narrows perception. Even in personal ambition, I see it constantly. Entrepreneurs who sacrifice health, relationships, and integrity because they're chasing an outcome they believe will finally bring peace. They don't notice when the goal replaces the person. Studies on burnout show that people are most likely to violate their own values when identity becomes fused with results. If success defines you, anything that threatens it feels existential. Here's the dangerous illusion that ties all of this together. People believe pressure is temporary. They tell themselves they'll slow down after the deadline, after the promotion, after the crisis passes. But pressure doesn't resolve itself. It escalates. And each time you justify crossing a line, the next one gets easier to cross. The hopeful part is that awareness changes the trajectory. Once I recognized this pattern outside the military, I could spot it early. The moment urgency starts silencing curiosity, the moment efficiency overrides empathy, those are the warning signs. Researchers who study ethical decision-making say the biggest predictor of moral failure isn't character. It's time pressure combined with isolation. That's why the solution isn't just personal discipline. It's structure, external checks, honest conversations. In the teams, we had debriefs not to assign blame, but to restore perspective. In civilian life, most people operate without those guardrails. They're alone with their justifications. The mistake people keep making is believing they're immune because they're not like that. That belief is what makes you vulnerable. I thought I was immune too. I trusted my training, my values, my experience. None of that stopped me from drifting when momentum took over. There's a simple rule I started applying everywhere once I saw the pattern clearly. If a decision requires you to hide it, rush it, or justify it excessively, it's already suspect. Behavioral researchers refer to this as the transparency test. If you wouldn't calmly explain the decision to someone you respect, you shouldn't make it under pressure. Most people ignore that signal because slowing down feels costly, but the real cost comes later. Relationships erode, trust fractures, self-respect weakens, and unlike external failures, those costs don't come with clear feedback loops. You just wake up one day feeling disconnected from the person you thought you were. What happened to me forced a reckoning, not with war, but with how humans behave when they believe the ends justify the means. Combat made the lesson unavoidable. Life keeps it subtle, and that's what makes it dangerous. If you're paying attention, you can catch it early, before it turns into regret, before it turns into something you have to carry. The line doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to be distracted, and pressure is the perfect distraction. Everything I learned from that experience eventually condensed into one rule, not a slogan, not a motivational phrase, a rule I apply when things move fast and the stakes feel high. Because pressure has a way of convincing you that complexity demands force, when in reality it demands clarity. The rule is simple. Control yourself before you try to control the situation. That might sound obvious, but almost nobody does it when it matters. Under pressure, the instinct is to act first and regulate later. That's backwards. According to modern neuroscience, once your nervous system is hijacked by stress, your range of choices collapses. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to your conditioning. That's true in combat, business, relationships, everywhere. The danger is assuming discipline alone will save you. Discipline is powerful, but without awareness, it becomes mechanical. It keeps you moving, not necessarily in the right direction. I used to think being strong meant pushing through hesitation. Now I understand that hesitation, when properly examined, is information. It's your internal systems flagging something that doesn't align. Here's how I apply the rule in real time. When urgency spikes, I pause for one full breath longer than feels comfortable, not to relax, but to regain authorship over my actions. Researchers studying elite performers have found that extending the exhale by just a few seconds signals safety to the brain, restoring access to higher reasoning. It's a physiological reset, not a philosophical one. Then I ask one question, not a moral debate, just a check. Is what I'm about to do driven by intent or by momentum? Intent is quiet, it's deliberate. Momentum is loud and impatient. Learning to tell the difference changed everything for me. Most people make the same mistake I did. They wait for a crisis to develop before checking themselves. By then, options are limited. The small secret that actually works is catching the shift early. The moment your tone sharpens, the moment you stop listening, the moment you start justifying instead of explaining. Those are the early indicators that control is slipping. Military doctrine has evolved to recognize this. Modern leadership training emphasizes self-regulation as a force multiplier, not because it makes you softer, but because it makes you accurate. According to leadership researchers, the most trusted leaders aren't the most aggressive, they're the most predictable under stress. Predictability builds safety. Safety restores performance. The hopeful part is that this skill compounds. Every time you interrupt momentum, you reinforce choice. You teach your nervous system that speed doesn't require sacrifice. Over time, pressure loses its grip, not because life gets easier, but because you stop being dragged by it. I'm not interested in motivating you. Motivation fades. I'm interested in giving you a tool you can use when your mind is screaming at you to act, because the moments that shape you don't announce themselves. They arrive disguised as urgency. The horrific part of my story wasn't that I made a mistake, it was that I didn't slow down soon enough to see it forming. That's why I talk about this now, not to dwell on the past, but to interrupt someone else's momentum before it costs them something they can't easily get back. Strength isn't how far you can push, it's how well you can regulate when pushing feels justified. Clarity isn't found after the storm, it's built before you step into it. Step into. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Pressure will always try to take the wheel. Your job isn't to eliminate it. Your job is to make sure it doesn't drive you somewhere you don't want to go.